Year 2003, Argentina. Lucas was in love with their new house, a large three-story house on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, with a spacious and lush courtyard that provided enough room for Lucas, who was 10 years old and playful, to play. But it only took a week for Lucas to experience the scariest days of his life in that house, all because of the strange noises heard throughout the day and night. The house was over 50 years old, and Lucas's father had bought it for a price cheaper than its real value, which Lucas and his family gradually found out the reason behind it, especially when they realized that the terrifying sounds they heard were related to the dark past of the house. Everything started from the third day of living in the new house. Lucas was busy reading his favorite book about aliens in his room when he noticed the angry voice of his mother, Martina, asking him to stop the noises. When Lucas curiously left his room, he saw his mother standing in front of the staircase leading to the second floor, asking him to stop running around and come down, even though Lucas hadn't gone upstairs that day and was standing right behind her. When Lucas called out to his mother, Martina screamed in terror because, apart from him, there was no one else in the house. But Martina was sure she had heard footsteps from the second floor while she was working in the kitchen. Lucas laughed at his mother at that moment, thinking Martina was imagining things. However, a few hours later, during dinner with his mother and older sister Lola, the sound of someone running on the second floor shattered the silence of the house, leaving all three of them terrified. The second floor had no entrance other than the stone staircase that passed through the front door of the first floor, and if someone wanted to go upstairs, they had to enter the house and they would surely be seen. Yet that night, like the nights before, as soon as it got dark, Martina had locked the house until her husband, who worked late at the factory, came home. Only 3 days had passed since they moved into that house, so the only answer they had for the noises was that someone was living secretly on the second floor. For this reason, Martina took a large knife from the kitchen and went upstairs with her children, threatening the person who was on the second floor with contacting the police. But not only did the noises not stop, they continued for minutes. Martina immediately called her husband and told him the story. Lucas' father returned home earlier than usual that night, and they all went upstairs, but all the doors and windows were closed, and there was no sign of anyone there. Although Lucas's fear had diminished that night with his father's words and explanations, real terror came to him a few nights later, when he woke up from a loud scream of a woman coming from the basement. At first, he thought it was Lola screaming, and something had happened to his sister. But when he came out of his room, he saw Lola and his mother standing in the narrow hallway of the basement, which was in the middle of the narrow hallway of the house, with fear and concern because they had also heard the screams. The basement of the house was about 100 meters long and was filled with extra household items, and its door was always locked. None of them had the courage to go down the stairs, but just like the sounds from the second floor, when Martina tried to find out who was in the basement with screams and threats, no one responded. 2 weeks had passed since they moved into the new house, but every moment of life in the new house was filled with fear and stress for Lucas. It didn't matter what time of day it was, the sound of footsteps from the second floor and the terrifying screams from the basement were always heard, to the point that Lucas slept in Lola's room at night, until they realized they weren't the only ones hearing the sounds. It was something Lola discovered during a conversation with her new friend who lived in the same neighborhood, when her friend asked her a strange question. "Do you hear the voices too?" And this was despite Lola not telling anyone about the noises they heard in the house. Lola's friend's reference was to a family who lived in that house 3 years ago and claimed to hear screams in the house. Lucas and his family's stay in their new home did not last longer than 2 months, and the reason was the things Martina had heard from the neighbors about the house's past after questioning them. That the house was used as a hidden place for torturing opponents of the government during the dictatorship of the 80s and 90s in Argentina, and many people were tortured and killed in that house. Although everything was just a rumor, what Martina heard about torture matched the screams they all heard from the basement. This is the story of an incident that happened in 2005 to one of my friends named Mason in the Osterbro neighborhood of Denmark. Mason, like everyone else, believed that the noises and strange occurrences his classmate, Oliver, saw and heard in his house were due to the substances he consumed until Mason experienced them himself. Shortly after Oliver left the mysterious house due to its affordable price, Mason moved in. It was a 50-square-meter, one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor, perfect for a single student like Mason. But it only took a few days for Mason to notice the strange events he had previously heard from Oliver. Events that began with hearing noises from the kitchen. About a week into his stay, Mason was awake until late, preparing for an important exam the next day, when he heard someone walking in the house. The units on each floor were close together, and it was natural to hear sounds from the hallway or neighboring houses, but as time passed, Mason was convinced the sound was coming from his own kitchen. The sound of footsteps on the kitchen tiles was clearly audible, but when Mason entered the kitchen, no one was there. What was strange was that as soon as Mason entered the kitchen, the sound stopped, only temporarily, and only for the few minutes that Mason was in the kitchen. This was an event that repeated almost every night, but considering the age of the house, it was justifiable, and Mason eventually got used to it until a few nights later, when he woke up from a terrifying noise, the sound of a large number of silverware falling to the floor in the kitchen. He hurried to the kitchen and was shocked to find that there were nothing on the floor, and everything seemed normal. His first guess was that what he heard was in his dream, but when the same thing happened a week later in the presence of one of his friends, fear came to him for the first time. That night, Mason was playing PlayStation when his classmate, Martin, was asleep. And again, the sound of silverware falling to the ground broke the silence as if someone had angrily thrown them on the floor. This time, Mason was scared, not only because he was awake, but also because Martin was awakened by the sound. Martin, who had heard such stories from Oliver before, returned home that night, but Mason had no choice but to stay. The next day, Mason bought a small dog named Daffy and brought her home. What was strange was that with Daffy's arrival, the sounds completely stopped. But about a month later, Mason realized that the sounds were the least of his problems. It was past midnight when Mason returned home from a AA party with his friends. He was quite drunk and tipsy, but what he saw as soon as he entered his bedroom sobered him up. Mason's bed was right next to the terrace door, with about a meter of space between the bed and the wall in front of it, and it was a completely empty area. The reason for Mason's fear was exactly this, because he didn't know what Daffy was staring and growling at in the empty corners of the room. It was late, and Daffy's barking might wake up the neighbors. Mason tried to calm her down, but Daffy wouldn't stop, and the repetition of this event in the following days led Mason to temporarily entrust Daffy to one of his friends. 2 nights later, Mason found out the cause of Daffy's barking. It was about 3 in the morning when Mason woke up with a strange feeling, a feeling that someone was staring at him, someone whom Mason felt was present in the room and exactly behind him. Mason was lying on the side toward the terrace window, and although he didn't see anyone in the reflection in the window, he was so sure of his feeling that he didn't have the courage to look behind him. At that moment, the only thing he thought about was the Daffy's reaction in the of previous nights to something he didn't see. His heart was pounding out of fear, but instead of looking behind him, he preferred to do what he did when he was scared as a child. He pulled the blanket over his head and waited for the morning, while he was drenched in sweat from the heat. That night, was Mason's last night in that house.